The spellbook on my desk began to flutter through pages again. When I looked, it seemed that Icor was once again offering me exactly what I wanted. It was a spell to summon an army. And what is the catch? I scoffed as I closed the book. When I resumed pacing back and forth in my office, the spellbook fluttered open to the same page again. Clearly, Icor wanted me to cast it, but given the unexpected results of the last spell, I did not trust this book anymore. There were secrets in there, unintended consequences, hidden meanings, things I clearly did not understand. He had already fooled me once. There was no reason to believe he wouldn't do it again. When I descended to the village again that night, I was greeted by something new. There, in a long single-file line, evenly spaced about 5 feet apart, were 10 wooden pillars standing sentinel over the edge of the village. Initially, I thought the Vesuvians were constructing a wall or a defensive structure of some sort. As I drew closer and gained a better view, I found I couldn't have been more wrong. Atop each pole was the helpless body of a villager. Throats cut open, trails of dry blood down their chests, arms and legs tied behind them around the poles and nailed through to hold them in place. This was the Vesuvian form of crucifixion. While rare, more traditional forms of crucifixion were practiced elsewhere in Athela, but unlike others, the Vesuvian version wasn't about punishing the victim. It was meant as a warning and a reminder for everyone else. Clearly, something had happened during the day to bring about this sort of extreme retribution. Remaining in the shadows and making my way around the village, I managed to spot Phoebe again, trudging along with a bucket of water from post to post. Her eyes were vacant and downcast, shoulders slumped forward as she trudged along blindly. Clearly, something had taken a drastic toll on her today. I managed to get her attention in between stops, and we quietly made our way into another abandoned home, where she immediately broke down into barely coherent sobbing. Through the garbled cries, I managed to piece together what had happened during the day. As I'd expected, the 2 men I had killed the previous evening were eventually discovered. What I had not anticipated was their deaths were blamed on the villagers. The Vesuvian commander believed this was some sign of resistance to the occupation and gathered the villagers in the town center to demand answers. When no one came forward to offer any information or claim any responsibility, he chose to make an example. As a warning to the rest, he simply chose 10 random villagers and put them to death as I've already described. These were all innocent people whose blood was now on my hands, and tomorrow there would be more when they discovered the one I had fed upon tonight. More would follow if something didn't change quickly. I returned to the castle feeling guilty. It was a feeling I was becoming quite familiar with these days, but what else could I do? Things were a mess, and only getting worse. The initial Vesuvian assault on the Athela army had failed to break through. General Bertal still held his lines. It wasn't the strongest position, but he'd done the best he could given the terrain. His right was anchored against the foothills of Shady Peak, but his left was completely exposed. With the help of my new spies, I could see the Vesuvian cavalry slowly and quietly advancing south behind the rolling hills to hide their movement. It would take a little while for them to get into position, but by tomorrow evening Bertal's entire position would be flanked. He would have to withdraw or risk being cut off and surrounded. But there was still nothing I could do about any of this, and I retired just as the eastern sky began to show the faintest hints of blue. When I emerged from the crypts again that evening, I immediately used my companions to get a situational update. As expected, the Vesuvian cavalry had now formed their lines along the Saline River and were prepared to attack in the morning. The Athelon lines had not changed or shifted at all, so I could only assume that General Bertal remained unaware of the danger. In the morning, his entire army would be smashed, and the Vesuvians would have an open road all the way to Athela. When I checked in on the village, more guilt was heaped upon my shoulders. There were now twice as many vertical pillars as there had been last night. I dropped into my chair with a groan of frustration. It was my curse to feed, but it was the villagers who kept paying the price. This could not go on. I must do something. The spell book fluttered open and came to rest on the summoning spell once again. With a sigh of defeat and desperation, I began to read the spell carefully. Oddly enough, it wasn't all that complicated. I had the components needed, and it seemed rather straightforward. I read it over and over again, looking for any hidden meanings in the text, but I couldn't find any. The spell would do exactly what it said. Summon an army. The last spell Icor had convinced me to cast from this book didn't exactly go as planned, but I saw no other options, and if I was going to do this, I had to do it now before it was too late to affect the outcome of the war. So it was with some reservations that I began the casting. I pricked my finger on my fangs and let a single drop of blood mix with a pinch of dirt upon the desk. As soon as the final words of power left my lips, a phantom wind began to slowly gather strength in the room. It slowly grew in intensity and began to sweep through the halls of the castle and out into the courtyard. A low moan that was barely audible at first began to grow in volume until it seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. And just as it became maddening in its seemingly never-ending monotone, it stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. And then, outside, I began to hear a subtle shuffling, punctuated now and again by the sound of steel scraping on stone. The sound grew steadily louder and more persistent. When I walked to the balcony and looked down upon the courtyard, I could see what was happening. There, steadily walking, shuffling, and shambling forward from the back of the courtyard in a loose cluster, came the now animated bodies of all the dead soldiers that had been retired there. As you can imagine, it was quite a motley crew. The dull browns of Vesobian leather interspersed with the silver of Athelon breastplates, all covered with streaks and smears of dry blood. They moved rather slowly at first, as though reluctant to awaken from what should have been their final slumber, but the more they walked, the more fluid they became as the stiffness of long unused joints began to mobilize once again. I watched in awe as they slowly began to form into ranks below me. When they finally came to a stop, commanders took their posts, and I was looking down upon a fully formed and organized army. Icor, I sighed. I should have guessed as much. I hadn't expected an army of the dead, but it would still be enough to do what I needed, and we descended from the castle a few minutes later under the moonlight. Confusion reigned as Vesobian guards raised the alarm at our approach. Vesobian commanders stumbled from their slumber and tried to hastily gather troops into fighting formations to stand against us. They knew there was no force to oppose them here in the pass, and yet an entire army was slowly coming down behind their lines. The raw panic was palpable, and the fear grew as small volleys of arrows rained down upon my forces to no effect. I can't even imagine the shock and the horror they must have experienced when my forces finally grew close enough for them to realize what they faced. The battle didn't last very long. My troops swept through their thin defenses easily and proceeded to wreak death and destruction through and beyond the village until no more Vesobians remained. When the spell ended, my troops began to fall to the ground once again, nothing more than lifeless corpses, and silence finally reigned over Dibbleburg. But something wasn't quite right. It was too quiet. When I'd cast the spell, I suspected there would be some unforeseen trick from Icor. It is why I didn't trust that book, and why I hadn't cast the spell sooner. My mistake was assuming the form of the army was Icor's little trick. After all, an army of the dead wasn't exactly what I thought I was conjuring, but now, looking over the battlefield, I found that the trick was far worse. There were so many bodies that it was difficult to really see at first, but as I walked along the main street through the center of town, one body stood out to me from the rest. A simple brown cloth dress tied at the waist by a green sash, long dark curls obscuring the face. This was not the dress of any soldier, and it was a look I had recently become familiar with. When I knelt down to brush the hair aside, Icor's trick was finally revealed as I saw the now dark, lifeless eyes of Phoebe looking back at me. Scanning the rest of the village, I could now see here and there, scattered among the leather and plate armor of soldiers, lay the bloody bodies of the other villagers. My army had not just killed the Vesobians, they had killed everyone. The guilt I felt before was nothing compared to the guilt I felt now, and I hung my head in shame as I retreated back to the welcoming darkness of the castle crypts. Over the course of the next few days, General Bertal's army marched through the Norgrim Pass. With the destruction of their army, the Vesobians could mount little resistance to his advance, and in a short time he had once again secured the city of Wittich. I did not make contact with him or anyone else after that night. The bodies strewn about were easily identified as not just Vesobians, but also those of my knights. Without me to tell them what had really happened, rumors and assumptions began to fill in the blanks, and I let them imagine whatever they liked. It was easier than accepting my responsibility for the truth, and slowly, history was written by people who had not been there to see it. Soon enough, not even the few knights that had survived that first attack on the castle could dispel the assumptions. Athelon history now tells that Count Dietrich von Dibbelberg cleverly lured the Vesovians into the pass by concealing his forces. As the Vesovians advanced and met General Bertal just east of the village, Count Dietrich sprang his trap and descended upon them. With the Athelon army in front and Count Dietrich behind, the Vesovian forces were surrounded. In desperation, they began to brutally murder the civilians trapped between the battle lines in the hope that doing so could force the Athelon forces to negotiate and at least allow them to retreat. But General Bertal knew it was futile to negotiate with them. If he allowed such a deal, the Vesovians would simply start using more civilians as shields. No, they had to be crushed here and now for the sake of all of Athela. Unfortunately, all of the valiant knights and the poor trapped villagers perished in the ensuing fight, but they had sacrificed themselves for the glory of Athela and would forever be remembered as heroes. It was a naive and, if I might say so myself, quite nauseating story, but people do love heroes, even if they have to make them up. Any true historian could tell this story wasn't true because it completely ignores the initial attack on Calborn Castle. An attack they knew had happened because of the few survivors I had sent with the villagers to Athela. But even in Etia, time blurs the hard facts of history until you're left with little more than fanciful stories, and this is the story now taught to Athelon children. Soon enough, there would be no one left who knew what had really happened except for me, and when the war was over, I had my own goals to pursue. It took a few days, but General Bertal eventually liberated Wittich, and the great debate began in the palace of Athela. Should they invade or once again hold and send Emperor Kosan peace terms? My own counsel would have been to invade. Thanks to my unexpected help, except for a light scuffle with the Vesovian garrison at Wittich, General Bertal's force had not yet engaged in a serious battle. They were still more or less at full strength and nowhere near exhausted. It was my belief that Emperor Kosan would never stop trying until Athela showed him the futility of the effort. Marching into Vesovia would send a clear message that he was not as safe as he imagined himself to be. Perhaps that would convince him that another attempt might cost him his throne. But I was not part of the conversation, and as I've said before, General Bertal was a notoriously cautious man. Peace terms were delivered to Vesovia, and the war came to an end just as the previous one had. General Bertal's army was dispersed, and what was left of my knights, along with the few reinforcements, returned to garrison at Calborn Castle. A missed opportunity and a mistake in my opinion, but then, while I still remained as Count of Dibbelberg, the ultimate fate of Athela was no longer my concern. I had my own issues to attend to. When the peace terms were accepted, the villagers of Dibbelberg began their journey to return to town. A few nights later, I watched through the eyes of the wolves as the villagers slowly filtered back to their homes. While they were clearly disturbed by the brutal carnage that yet remained in the streets, I was completely filled with joy when I saw one villager in particular, Celine. I was so excited to finally be with her that I ran out the main doors and halfway across the courtyard before I even noticed the pale blue in the eastern sky. Dawn was near. The cruel irony of my condition. I am a man with all the time in the world, and yet there was not enough time to go to her. I cursed Icor once again, and with no small amount of anger, I reluctantly retired to the crypts to impatiently await nightfall.